Um, Welcome to the joint work session portion of our meeting this evening. We're delighted to have our school board friends with us here today. It occurred to me, John, that maybe we could start with Mr. Shields going through the changes that have been made to the document for the benefit of ourselves and the public, the latest changes that were made. That'd be okay with you?
Yeah, that'd be fine. First, we have the one procedural thing we have to get cleared up. Mr. Castillo has notified the board that he is unable to attend the meeting tonight due to an emergency, due to a personal matter, and he has identified with specificity the nature of the personal matter being a trip scheduled prior to the scheduling of this special meeting, and in accordance with Board Policy 2.23, given that a quorum of the board is physically assembled here, he requests permission to participate via telephone from a location that is not open to the public. So what I need is a motion to allow him to approve to participate remotely.
So moved.
Second.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you.
Okay, great. Sure. Welcome, Justin. Mr. Shields, are you ready to go through the document? I've also asked him to provide some hard copies for those of us who don't happen to have a hard copy to take notes on. Those will be coming shortly. But in the meantime, why don't you go ahead and get started and take us through the changes that were made based on our last joint work session.
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, and I'll be happy to do that. We do have copies on the way down, and in the meantime, I'll just have the track changes version up on the wall. So from the work session discussion last week, where we had a really long and detailed discussion about the RFP, significant changes were made, and some of the areas were in terms of the overall emphasis on the commercial program, what the purpose of the commercial program was for. Those were addressed, and I'll discuss that. There were questions about the referendum requirement, questions about public input and how it fits into this process, and I'll talk about that last. But let's just dive into the document itself. Let me set the about. So what council and school board have in their packet is the clean copy. I think emailed out was the track changes version. But so in the introduction, there was discussion about the emphasis right off the bat. And so changes were made to describe that the redevelopment and commercialization of a portion of the school campus to generate revenue to help fund the capital costs of the new and expanded school facilities, create a sense of place, and bring desirable commercial activity and amenities to the city. Also in the introduction area, there's the comment that it read as if the purpose of the commercial development was solely to fund the school facilities, and the intent was to expand that to note that it was to spur further economic development. But again, those are just in the introductory, which are very sort of summary treatment of what the goals and purposes of the RFP are. At 2.1, project overview, there's a notation that the school board and the city wish to permit development of up to 10.38 acres of the parcels and use the short and long-term proceeds of the development to help fund the replacement of the high school and expansion of the middle school and spur further economic development. In section 2.2, the replace or renovate the existing George Mason High School was added. That had already been added to the project scope of work, but it's noted here in the project goals as well. And then again, in paragraph C, 2.2C, the notation of spurring further economic development. So the project scope of work is where some of the most significant changes were. In terms of the wording for both Mary Ellen Henderson and the George Mason High School, the language was changed from must accommodate X number of students to here, the new high school is expected to accommodate 1,500 students, and then at the Mary Ellen Henderson section, the expansion is expected to accommodate an additional 400 students. Under redevelopment, a portion of the parcels, there's a good deal of comment and discussion on this section, and it's been, a lot of the concepts in the first draft are kept here, but it's essentially rewritten. And the 3 bullets are trying to concentrate on 3 things. 1, the land transaction, maximizing financial value from the land transaction. 2, maximizing the long-term tax yield, which is characterized as the net fiscal impact. And then 3, concerns with design. So I'll just read the section as it is right now. Redevelop up to 10.38 acres of the parcels for commercial or a mix of uses in a manner that, 1, maximizes the financial value of the property to the city and the school board. Note, the city and school board prefer to retain fee and simple ownership of the property through a structure such as a long-term ground lease, but will consider other land transaction structures. 2, maximizes the net fiscal impact to the city through high-quality commercial uses. Note, for these purposes, the net fiscal impact is the projected tax yield minus the projected costs for the city and Falls Church City Public Schools services once the redevelopment is completed. And 3, features outstanding design, including exemplary architecture, pedestrian-friendly streets, lively public and commercial spaces with a sense of place, environmentally sustainable buildings and infrastructure, and other enhancements to the parcels that will benefit the city and surrounding community. So that's the rewording of that section. We kept in the language that the city will consider redevelopment that requires rezoning and the creation of a new zoning district. Then I'll skim ahead to the next area of change, 3.2, the schedule. So the discussion at the work session was that it might not be just a bond referendum, it could be a referendum for some other purposes. And so we struck the reference to bond and it put in instead a public referendum, and that's for the only change to that section. The schedule, though, changes the word bond and replaces the word public as well. And then under public comment and conduct public hearings, that's just notes the public hearing and it on the detailed proposals. And I'll talk a little bit more about public input in the process in just a moment. The evaluation team has not yet been appointed, so that was put into the future tense. In section 4.5, qualifications and experience, we've through the scope of work now, the emphasis really is on commercial real estate development, and so we struck the reference to and/or mixed-use real estate development. Under project characteristics, we ask for under 4.6b. A, to identify and fully describe any work that we, the school board or the city, or any public entity would need to do, and we also ask for the timing of when that work would need to be done. We add a section K here as well, which is to identify and describe any involvement in project development on the part of any owners or tenants of adjacent properties. I will note that the adjacent property owners have received a draft of this RFP draft, so they are informed that the discussion is happening. We have not received any comment from them on it. And I'm almost done, but I will note this is a technical section in 5.1 relating to the fact that for the purposes of this RFP only, the Section 5.0 supersedes the provisions of Section 8 of the guidelines with respect to the evaluation of conceptual proposals. And that was put in at the advice of legal counsel. And project characteristics, we added in the renovation of the high school and middle school, so that change is made here. And then under paragraph C, the language tracks now the scope of work, which I read earlier. I won't read it again, but that language essentially mirrors that earlier language. And I think those are the significant changes. In terms of public involvement, one of the aspects of the PPEA and proceeding along this route of procurement, back when the General Assembly approved the PPEA, a lot of the context was to allow public sector entities to be able to do business more like the private sector does, in a more streamlined fashion, with the idea that the public sector could try to capture some of the benefits that the private sector often gets when the private sector conducts projects. And so that is really very much part of the PPEA process. And so that's one aspect of how this process, in terms of how it would proceed under the PPEA Act. A key concept is that the proposers are engaged in a competitive process, and that competitive process is what creates value for the public entity. And so for the proposers to have confidence in that process, they will want to keep their trade secrets, they want to keep their ideas, their proposals confidential so that their competitors can't incorporate those ideas into the second phase, the more detailed phase proposal. So particularly for this phase one conceptual step in the process, there is an emphasis on keeping the confidentiality of a lot of the sort of the substance of the proposals that come before us. The executive summary will be public. The team, the qualifications of the team, and all the entities associated with the proposal would be public, and their cover letter would be public. But that typically, as we know from the unsolicited proposal, is all that's disclosed in this phase one of this procurement process. We have researched the matter of the involvement of other bodies in the deliberative process when the school board and the city council goes in to hear the evaluation team's analysis of the projects, that other bodies such as the Planning Commission or the Economic Development Authority could be brought into those closed sessions to hear that information with you, and so that A, they're informed, and B, so that the council can gauge some of the reaction of those bodies. However, that information, anybody who's brought into those closed sessions, the basic principle would hold is that the information needs to be kept confidential to guard the integrity of the procurement process. In phase two, if we take that step, there would be a short list of proposers, and we'd ask for detailed proposals. And at that, as we're evaluating those proposals, there is a public hearing process, and we will work with legal counsel, outside legal counsel, within the bounds of the PPA. I think there's been no question that the direction to us from our elected bodies is that you want as much public involvement as possible. And so we will continue with legal counsel to try to make that happen. What is typically done is there's a public hearing in the phase two before the decision is made on your top ranked respondent. And then there would be a period of entering into a negotiated comprehensive agreement. And once that comprehensive agreement is agreed to, and it might be agreed to on an interim basis, contingent upon the voters' approval at a public referendum the following fall. But once that comprehensive agreement, even if it's an interim agreement, we believe would then be made fully public, and all the details of the proposal would be public, and the voters would know very clearly those details before they cast their vote and became ultimately the deciders as whether the project proceeds or not. So that is the method that we believe fits the PPA, and that's the advice we've been given on how the public aspects of this would be handled. So that's a summary of the changes and the discussion up to this point, and we know there's probably more questions, and we'd be happy to take those and respond as best we can.
Might I suggest maybe we start with any unresolved questions for staff, and then maybe go through the document and see if anyone has any additional comments on the changes that were made as a starting point. Does that sound good, John? Okay. Mr. Baruch?
So I had a couple preliminary questions that I had raised before that I think some members of the council also shared. One involved outreach to other stakeholders, VDOT, et cetera. So I'd like to get a better understanding from staff of how we're sketching that out, and if anything on that front has been done. And I know it's short fuse in the last week. And then two, I'd raise the issue of we go forward with the RFP, but what are we going to measure it against, and how are we going to do that specifically, other than what's been done so far? So if we can get a readout of that, and then I've got some further specific comments about the RFP and the edits.
The outreach, a copy of the draft RFP has been sent to UVA, Virginia Tech, WMATA, to Supervisor Faust's office, and to VDOT. And so that's who we've reached out to. And each of those parties, we've been engaged, really starting 18 months ago, to let them know about when we were just doing the plan for planning, brought them into the process. We have not received any comments on the RFP itself, but we've tried to make it very clear that if there are any questions or comments, to contact us.
And when did that go out?
The RFP itself was sent out either on Friday or today.
Great. And they knew that we were going to be discussing it today? Is that it?
Yes.
Thank you.
And so, and one note with VDOT, we will, our past experience with VDOT is they would like to have actual plans before they really spend a lot of time with us. But we do want to sit down with them just to try to do some advanced outreach to them. And that would not be their, at any rate, that's underway.
And we're encouraging that in the document from the proposers as well, whoever they may be.
I think typically the proposers would have their own transportation consultants, and they would probably rely on them before going directly to VDOT.
And then as far as developing metrics or some measures to evaluate these things in, that's our own work without hiring, mega consultants to give us the same thing that we're asking the marketplace.
So we will have, on our team, we'll have the owner's rep for the schools, we'll have our financial advisor, Davenport, we will have our outside legal counsel. We are also, believe we will need to have real estate transactional assistance, and that piece of our team is not decided upon yet, and so we'll come back to the council and school board on that piece of it. Those are some of the key members of the team that will help with the evaluation. The evaluation, though, is driven by the section that's in the RFP, the section 5.5, the evaluation criteria, and so that would be the foundation of how the evaluation would be run.
Have involved anybody who understands sort of the marketplace or what can be done on that site as well?
I'm sorry?
Of what can be done on the site in the marketplace?
Well, the real estate advisor would be our...
So that the
Our member
real
of the
estate
team would
advisor
help
is
us
not
on that.
simply a transactional person. It's somebody who's a broker or in the development field somehow that could advise us on that.
The value is driven by uses and density, and so, the valuation, what we will want then is, given proposers' uses and density, we'll want some truth testing as to whether their value is appropriate for what they're proposing. And I think that's the professional assistance that we would have in hand.
Will they also be able to truth test things like, well, no, office building can't be done, or hotel can't be done, or X can't be done?
Well, I think there's going to be some real testing of assumptions with the proposers. I think we will, spend time with them to really test their assumptions, and through the combination of our expert team and what they're proposing, I think we'll just have to make judgments as to the feasibility of what the proposers are proposing.
Okay, and the city and the schools still maintain the ability to reject all the proposals for whatever reason, even if they meet the criteria?
Yes.
Carol, is that a yes from?
Yes, I think the language in the RFP is very clear that we could reject all the proposals at any time.
At any time? Okay. And for whatever reason?
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions of staff? Anyone else? Should we get into the document then? All right, why don't we go, Mr. Shields, why don't you go to the beginning of the document? We'll just scroll through it quickly, and maybe we can stop whenever someone has a comment. To predict your second. Mr. Baruch, do you have a
start.
comment before we get started?
I've already said these to Wyatt earlier today, but I appreciate the changes that were made about just clarifying what we're talking about when we're talking about the high school, that it includes the possibility for renovation rather than build anew, but it's sort of missing in the actual resolution itself in the motion, or the motion actually has it, the draft motion, but the title is kind of missing that concept. So, because it keeps talking about a new George Mason. So that's one change we might want to make. Yeah, optics, what we talked about earlier, sort of jumped out at me is the first thing that I noticed this document. That's where my eyes went. What's the title of this thing that we're dealing with? Sorry. Even though I'm not acting as the lawyer, I just can't help myself sometimes. We've never noticed that. Never known. It's never gotten into legal, I have to say. It's always been top level. And that shows up sort of throughout the document. I think I pointed some of those areas out to Wyatt, but I'm not going to
I will just say this, and this is probably a school question, but in going through the document, we went through dozens of places and changed out where it just said new and added renovate as well. But we were mindful of the fact that in the scope of work, new high school is defined as either renovated or build new. And so we didn't change it everywhere, partly just because it started to get cumbersome. But, you know, in terms of how the school board and the city council want to communicate this, if there are other places to change it, we can do that.
Mr. Vice Chair?
And I don't know if our resolutions are the same or have to be the same, but I had the same reaction, and one thing I sent in to this morning was to say add renovate to ours, and also our resolution still said the point of it was just to generate revenue, and I'm going to propose language that says and to create a great place for the community, because that's something else that we very much said needed to be in there. But again, it's simply making things consistent, not a new idea.
Yeah, not to meddle in your affairs, I wonder if you might want to use the same language that's in the RFP about a sense of place and whatever else, the same lingo and jargon in your motion that's actually used in the RFP might be good for consistency's
Any
sake.
consistency is good.
Mr. Snyder?
Thank you. I note in the proposed motion on page 4, line 132, we talk about a public referendum, quote, if needed, end quote. And furthermore, on page,
Mr. Snyder, are you in the resolution or in the RFP?
starting with the resolution, and then I'm going to go to the RFP. Might as well take this issue, just bring it all together. And then the footnote on page 6 of the RFP, I note that on that same page, we talk about a public referendum, and then footnote 6 seems to suggest that may not happen. So I think that it's very important that we make clear that we're going to have a public referendum. So that means a change to the motion to delete if needed on line 132. And it means deleting that footnote, which casts a real doubt as to whether we're going to do a referendum or not. So those might be my suggestions on that issue.
So maybe I could suggest this. I think it's a good point that you've raised, but maybe as in an effort to get through the document, should we just go chronologically through the document and then take all the changes? Otherwise, I think we'll end up jumping around through the document. Why don't we hold that thought? I think it's a good one. But maybe we could just start with the beginning and just roll through. Did we hit a point of contention or a change, and then maybe hold that for a bit? So, Mr. Shields, where are we in the document? Is this the first, does anyone have any comments up? I guess I would just say stop.
That's the introduction, so here's where we are.
Yeah, so those are changes that were made based on our extensive discussion last week. Does that work for folks, the introductory language? Okay. Do we want to keep on going then, Mr. Shields?
Okay. And then Romanet 2, the addition of spur further economic development.
Okay. Any comments? Okay. Do you have a comment?
I think we need a moment to clarify.
Sure, okay.
Are we starting through the RFP? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, uh-huh.
Okay, thank you.
So we okay, then I guess we're on section 2. Are there any changes or requested changes to this portion of the document? Okay.
All right. And then section 2.2, we have the renovation in A, and then in C, new Romanet 2, spur further economic development.
Okay, any comments? Okay, why don't we keep going?
The scope of work must switched with is expected to.
Okay.
And then section C,
Could I ask a question about that?
Sure, of course.
Thanks. I just wanted to know from the schools folks, what is the projection for when we reach capacity on those numbers that we cite there? Is it a 10-year out, 15-year out? Any back of the envelope guess at when we get to 1,500 and 1,000?
We do have projections that are based solely off Weldon Cooper, and at 2029, with no economic development, we are already at 1,200. And then when you take the economic development from Lincoln, Rushmark, and anything else that would be coming online, those numbers get added in, and we have about another 4 or 5 years, depending on how quickly that growth takes off. But 2029, we're already at 1,200 just from natural growth. And you have to also have a little bit of extra cushion in a building as well.
That's for the high school.
Open.
You're talking for the high school, right?
Yes, that's the high school.
Okay, so 2029, not including Lincoln and Rushmark. If it includes Lincoln and Rushmark, you get to the capacity sooner, or, I mean, we're doing Lincoln and Rushmark, right? I mean, we know those are going to open. That's not,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of the question.
we know Lincoln and Rushmark are going to come online. We don't know exactly how many kids, but
Right.
we've got estimates that help us give some idea. So you're saying it'll be 2025, maybe, if Lincoln and Rushmark come in at the numbers that we expect, when you would hit?
You still have that 2029 number, it's just instead of 1,200, it starts to creep up larger. And I don't have it in front of me right now, but I can certainly pull it up.
Okay, so anyway, 2029, right now, we're in 2015. So safe to say that,
So the building opens in 19.
safe to say that the building opens and is good for at least 10 years with the capacity that we envision, and probably much longer.
Yes.
Okay.
If I could follow up on that question, what rate of growth does that assume? 4%. So you anticipate for the next, I don't know how many years that was, 10 to 15 years, a 4% annual increase in high school population, I presume general school population as well?
That's correct. And when you actually look at the numbers going forward, it's very similar to how we looked going backwards. And Hunter and I have ran all of those numbers based off just community questions that we've had in the last couple of weeks. It does sound like a lot of children, but we are growing.
Okay. Unless there are any other questions, why don't we focus on this section C on the screen right now? Does anyone have any comments about this language? Mr. Snyder?
I have one quick comment, and I think it's consistent with the changes that have been made. In that first unnumbered line, it says redevelop up to 10.38 acres of the parcels for commercial. or a mix of uses, and I would urge the addition of that are predominantly commercial in a manner that. So it allows the possibility of residential, but it really pushes hard toward commercial and a mix of commercial uses.
Okay, so I hope people understood the comment. Are there any comments to the comment? So again, it would be language which I think after the word mix of uses which are predominantly commercial, that would be the addition?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. C?
Thank you, Mayor. I oppose that inclusion. I think we have enough references to commercial here. And in fact, the title says commercial development. I don't know why we need to gild the lily, and there's a point here where I think we're just being senselessly redundant. And when you put in predominantly commercial, it just, I think, makes all of us look incompetent that we're saying it one more time in another place when we know that the landscape currently with regard to office buildings is that people don't want to work in them because there's no place for them to go after work. Those places go dark after 5:30. And in fact, there's a movement and conversions for office buildings to be turned into residential, schools, and churches. So I don't know why we want to be on record saying we want more of that. I think at the very least, it makes it seem as if we don't know what we're doing.
Other comments? Vice Mayor Snyder?
Different ways you could do this, but when you insert mix of uses, you're pointing toward the possibility of more of the same kind of commercial on one story, residential on the rest, and I want to stay away from that. I certainly take your view that, you know, there may or may not be office uses, and we may need some residential there, but when we added the or a mix of uses, it seems to me we're inviting the kind of so-called mixed use that we've had in the past, and I think that partly why we need a new school is exactly that development. Now, we may need some of it, but I want to emphasize that we're not opening the door to that particular model.
Other comments? Ms. Kearney?
I would say that I agree with Dan Z. I think we're making it quite clear here in item number 1 that we're looking to maximize financial value of the property to the city, and in 2, to maximize the next fiscal impact. You know, developers, this is their business, and they're pretty smart about it, and what we want, I think, in this phase is for them to bring us an indication of what the best and highest use of the property is, as long as it complies with number 3, which is, you know, good place. I think we see what comes in the first phase, and based on that, we'll develop the detailed RFP, and we may decide to do some things differently there, but my hope had been that this RFP would be as open as we could make it, so we would get a true sense of what the best and highest use is for the property based on the marketplace.
Other comments? I have to say, I don't object to Mr. Snyder's language. I would hope that we would, I understand the concerns of others, and I don't think we want a place that's going to be dead at night where there's no activity on weekends or nights. But I am concerned that multifamily residential may be the predominance of what we receive, because that's right today the most financially lucrative thing in the marketplace. And I think we need to have a long-term vision for this, which has a mix of uses that includes hotels, hopefully some office, strong retail component. So I do share some of that concern. I also have a minor comment to little 3 here. I don't know if this is the right time or not. It says pedestrian-friendly streets. I might add pedestrian and bike-friendly streets. So, anyway, can we hear from others on this topic, the main topic, Mr. Baruch?
I think I was probably the last meeting since Mr. Snyder wasn't available, one of the most vocal on this issue about needing to provide clarity on this point. So I would certainly support the vice mayor's notion. And in fact, I was intending at the work session to take it further, and would still even support taking it further, such as listing. And Mr. Z, I take your point about office right now, and that may not be viable at the time, but it may change in the future. But there's other usage that are still growing, that we're still seeing interest in the city, such as hotel and other commercial activity. So one approach to this, again, would be the vice mayor's suggestion, which I would support. Another would be also providing some more direction, which I'm willing to pull back on. But I think it makes sense to at least have further indication that we're really looking for commercial when we're talking about the mix of usage, even though we would allow some residential, but that can't be more of the same. And I'd rather say that up front rather than get a bunch of proposals that are more of the same, and we've gotten the community engaged and this thing is further out, and we're then struggling to restart the clock where we're getting a big push that we must have a school. And we look back and find ourselves that maybe we weren't clear enough. So I think clarity is not going to harm us if we do it in a balanced way, and I think what's on the table and the various approaches to make that clarity there is one that I would support.
I think we have a comment from the iPhone, so why don't we hold that up to the microphone?
All right, Justin, let's give this a shot. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, thank you all for indulging me in dealing with the audio issues. I do think we've talked about this a lot, and so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. I think if we want to talk about outcomes, I think that's a wise way to go at it. And if there are things that we want to avoid in terms of outcomes, then we should do that. But I am concerned if we're overly prescriptive, we could end up not seeing some potentially good outcomes. So I would say let's keep it broad. We can look and see what the development community advises, evaluate it. But I think we need to be open to the fact that the past history in Falls Church is not really going to be, we're in a completely new ball game here with this parcel. So we should keep our minds and eyes open and see what is proposed in as open-ended a way as possible.
Okay.
Okay, other comments from anyone?
I'm sorry, are we talking about Romanet 2 and the language which says?
The change would be in the precatory language before any of the Romanets. It would be redevelop up to 10.38 acres of the parcels for commercial uses or a mix of uses which are predominantly commercial in a manner that. So it would be an addition to the precatory language at the start of paragraph C or subparagraph C before any of the Romanets.
Okay, I see, I'm sorry. Thank you, Lawrence, and I have that sheet in front of me. I don't think it's necessary. I mean, it seems pretty clear that in Romanet 2, we specifically say high-quality commercial uses without even contemplating a mix of uses, which I think Romanet 2 should actually say a mix of uses including commercial, but I wouldn't advocate to change that because the intro language introduces a concept of a mix of uses, which is, sufficiently fuzzy enough language to get around some objections to mixed use if mixed use is seen as some of the kind of uses that we've had now, that we've had in the newer buildings that we brought in recent years. Of course, I don't need to give a long speech that I think those mixed uses, well, I don't think, I know, we have data that shows those mixed uses are strongly net revenue positive and are not in any way, shape, or form the primary driver of students that are leading us to increase school capacity. 70% of the student load is coming from established single family and other homes. But without getting into all that, I don't know, the vagueness of predominantly, number one, I think it would be predominantly, not predominately commercial, if you included that word. But the vagueness of that, I mean, if somebody came to us, let's say, with a component of this project that was, 51% residential in one of the buildings and 49% commercial, I don't think that would be predominantly commercial, and I certainly would want to, consider that if that were part of the plan. I don't know. It just doesn't seem necessary. It does seem to prescribe to the market, and the whole point of this is to go to the market and have the market tell us what it thinks would be the best blend of uses and the most economically beneficial to us.
Okay. Other comments? Ms. Connolly?
I really don't want to get hung up on these four little words. So I think it's one of those things that if it's there, it goes towards the whole set of paragraphs. If it's there, I think it's okay. If it's not there, I think it's okay. So I don't have a strong feeling either way. Probably doesn't help anyone. But I think that if you look at the whole section C here, it fits right in there with it or without it.
Okay, how about you, Ms. Oliver, at least from the council side?
I'm satisfied with either version of the language.
Okay, well, my goal is to work through the language tonight, now, so that we can all get a resolution on this. I'm not sure on the council side we have a resolution. I don't know if the school board, how you guys feel. I haven't heard too much.
Mr.
from you all.
Mayor,
Yes.
could I just point out one thing that may be useful in your considerations, and without really looking at, or I think this is a decision for you all, the policymakers, to make, but Section 2.2 of your RFP is the project goals, and if you look at Section B, it talks about redeveloping the 10.38 acres for high-quality commercial uses. And what you're looking at now and the change that you're considering, it goes into the scope of work, which is, I think, a section that might be seen as a little bit more prescriptive. And that may be what the council and the school board want to do, but I think that's something you ought to consider, is the location of the language about the commercial uses.
Okay, I think we need to work, or should work, for a consensus on this issue before moving on to the next one. Are there any other thoughts on this language? Mr. Sharp?
I'd like to understand better the change that's been made regarding transportation. There was a lengthier description earlier in this part. It's been pulled down to pedestrian-friendly streets. And if I recall correctly, particularly from Metro, there was a request more for access, and it may be across the site, which in this case would be, well, perhaps a street, perhaps not a street. And there was in the earlier language improvements for access to, from, and through the site. So I'd just like to understand what the reason was for the change and what this new language is intended to get instead of the earlier language.
Mr. Shields?
Well, so I think first of all, what the new language is trying to do is to identify 3 areas of concern. So one, the land transaction, 2, the long-term fiscal impact, and then 3, design, outstanding quality design. And so in rewriting Romanet 3, one of the main emphasis that we got from the work session, I think, was that idea of great place and pedestrian-friendly streets. So we tried to put that in. I think that the former language, which you can see in the cross-out, you know, in that construct, a lot of these concepts were sort of mixed up together, so we tried to pull them out. If that phrase of provide high-quality, effective transportation improvements for access to, from, and through the site is desired, one thing that, you know, we were thinking about with that was, for instance, how you walk across Haycock, which is, I know, you know, a point that had been raised at the school board meeting. So that, I will note that in the current phraseology is not there quite as strongly. But I think what we're trying to do with 3 is just lay out, we're looking for quality design.
Just perhaps a word that might help to cover these desired changes. Instead of saying pedestrian-friendly streets, perhaps pedestrian-friendly access is the better term.
So maybe before we get into that, well, why don't we try to resolve the other issue? And I know it doesn't seem like it has an apparent resolution right now, but I think we need to come to one to get through this document before it runs too late. Is there anyone else who has comments on this issue? Do we have any consensus one way or the other? Are people willing to concede the point one way or the other? Okay, I see no.
How about instead of predominantly, it says substantially? Then it
Okay, is that agreeable to folks?
No.
I see a head.
Significantly?
All right, so significantly, okay, well, let's make sure we all understand the change and we're okay with it. So do you understand the change, Mr. Shields?
So it would read, redevelop up to 10.38 acres of the parcels for commercial uses or a mix of uses which are significantly commercial in a manner that...
Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we have agreement on that? Okay, good. Let's move on before anybody changes their mind. And let's go on to Mr. Sharp's comment. Are there any comments to his comment?
Yeah, so I agree with Mr. Sharp on that language. One of the overarching goals of this development seems to be that it's pedestrian-friendly and that there'll be less parking spaces given the increased number of students. So if we're expecting people to walk to the property, we should give them a safe passage.
Other comments? I guess I would say if we're going to use pedestrian, I'd like the term and bike as well. Are there other comments to the comment? The electronic. All right. So do we have do we have agreement then on the proposal? I'm not sure we have actual language, but probably pretty close to it.
What was proposed is features outstanding design, including exemplary architecture, pedestrian-friendly access.
Pedestrian and bike.
Pedestrian and bike, I beg your pardon.
So, but we've got some of that already in there. I think really it's just an addition of access, pedestrian and bicycle access to and from the site or whatever was on there before. To, from, so I think it would just be the addition of a new Romanet that says something like provide high-quality, effective transportation improvements for access. Is that what it was? Is that? Yeah. Yeah, with maybe pedestrian, bike, and other means of transport, something like that.
So you would do that as Romanet 4?
I think that's what he's proposing. Maybe that's the simplest way to do it.
So take that former sentence and just add that as Romanet 4.
I think so, unless there's another way to work it in. It just might be the simplest way to, Mr. Z?
Yes, I think we ought to just try to work it in. This setting up transportation access in its own pedestal, I think, maybe just providing a message that we don't intend to send.
Okay. So we have another proposal just to use it as a subclause or something like that. Can we agree to the extent we will vote on this tonight that to allow some additional wordsmithing? In other words, the resolutions to allow the city manager and the superintendent to wordsmith some of the concepts, or the alternative is to do it right now?
Agreed.
Okay, so is there an agreement to allow a little flexibility so that they can wordsmith this, the next day or so?
All right, so we will add the word bike in, and we will work in that whole sentence in one form or another into that Romanet 3. And so that's what we'll do.
Let's keep going. What's the next item then?
So the next item then takes us to the referendum question.
Mr. Snyder, you had a comment, which we heard earlier.
We list public referendum. I think everyone assumes we're going to be doing that. But when you go down and you read the footnote, and yes, I'm sorry, I went to law school where you actually read footnotes. In fact, in some cases, they're more important than the actual document itself. It talks about, please note that any action or occurrence with regard to a possible public referendum is separate and apart from the PPA, and procurement references thereto in this schedule and this RFP are solely for planning purposes and should not be construed as or implying any certainty regarding the authorization or holding of a public referendum. So it seems to me that that casts an unnecessary doubt over whether we're going to hold a referendum on this. I think people are expecting it, and I think we need to be clear about it. That's
Okay,
all.
comments? Mr. Z? Vice Chair Lawrence?
I'm in complete agreement with the Vice Mayor.
Okay. Mr. Lawrence?
Just a question. If we change it to public instead of bond, if it ends up being a referendum for a bond, there's no problem, right?
Let's ask the city attorney. It seems like a bond referendum is a public referendum.
Yes, I think it is. It's one type of public referendum.
Okay.
Could I
Mr. Duncan, of course.
ask a question on this point? Just from a let's drive a hard bargain perspective, we would need, of course, be required to have a bond referendum if the cost of the facilities, the school facilities, exceeded 10% of our, right? What if we were trying to encourage one of the proposers to come in with a proposal that did not cost 10%? In other words, we want to incentivize a proposal that would minimize our cost, public cost, as much as possible. I'm just a little concerned that if we require a bond referendum, we are basically inviting the proposers to say, oh, well, they expect to spend, umpty $1 million on this project, so we don't have to worry about really sharpening our pencils.
Did you want to go, or I can go? I've got to come. So I think the idea, Mr. Duncan, is not necessarily a bond referendum, but a referendum by the public to have input on this process, which is in many ways not because of the nature of the beast, is not prone to a lot of public dissemination of information, et cetera. And so I think the idea is that the bottom line, that the buck will stop with the public. They will have ultimate decision-making power. And so I think that's the idea, not necessarily that the cost is such. I think if the cost was zero, I think many of us, maybe all of us, would like the public to weigh in nonetheless, because it's such a monumental project in the history of the city, and it involves, incredible ultimate cost and value to the city. So I think many of us would want to have a referendum irrespective of the cost, and it's not really geared towards the amount, it's geared towards
Okay,
the
I think that's
concept.
a good way to put it. Just, we're expressing our legislative intent here, and everything we say, if the proposers are paying close attention, they'll hear what you just said and understand that, we'd like to see a zero cost, but we are going to go to referendum for all the reasons that you state.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll all be listening to what I say, but anyway, Mr. Lawrence, did you have a comment as well, or Ms. Krosky?
If I could just mention, I mean, I think the reason this is drafted this way is really to preserve the options. You know, this is more than a year down the road. We don't know where we'll be. We don't know if we would have already said, we haven't gotten anything we like on this and we're not going to do it. So I understand we may have a desire to signal that we intend to get the public to weigh in on this, but in terms of the RFP, it may be wise to make sure that to some degree you are preserving your ability or a future council's ability to change their mind or do something different. And that's, you may wish to not do that, but I think that in terms of looking down the road, that's probably a better course, is to preserve the flexibility for a later date.
And just one other thought. If the council wanted to make that commitment, it could make that in a separate action as opposed to in the procurement documents. The procurement documents mean now you've involved other parties into that, what is really an internal governance issue. And if you were to make that commitment by separate resolution, then that would be an internal matter as opposed to involving the respondents.
Mr. Snyder, yes, of course.
I guess I'd like to signal to whoever is interested in this that we're going to the people on this. And then I think that imposes a certain amount of discipline on what they're going to do. So I think to put it in any other document and not put it in this one gives the impression that maybe we won't do a referendum. And if that's where people are, then I think we ought to state that tonight. But if we're going to commit to doing a referendum, then we ought to put it in this document.
Well, now you got me worried. So are we, in putting the language in that's there, public referendum November 2016, binding ourselves to conduct a referendum in November of 2016? I mean, what if we decide, gee, that's just too soon, you know, we're going to do it in 2017 or 2018? I mean, I don't want to tie the hands of a future council if they feel like that is too fast a timetable.
And I think the language has been drafted to say that you expect to hold that referendum, but it's not binding, and that things could change, and that the city council could decide. I mean, you could change the time. That's certainly one option. You may not be moving forward at that point on the same type of project. You don't know what the financing schemes that may be offered would be that might or might not require a referendum. You might still want to do them for the schools, but I think that's how it's been drafted, and I understand that you desire a level of commitment, but I think it is drafted right now to say one is expected at that time.
All right, that's fine.
Mr. Burr?
I think, Carol, with all due respect, I think that's sound legal advice as far as sort of the documents may go, but I think there's sort of the bigger policy issue of whether this council wants to commit to the public now before the process that this is going to go for a vote, and how we're going to do that. So to Mr. Shields' point, I'm not concerned about what documents it's in, but by the time I approve this thing, I want to know where the council is on this before I make my final vote, if that makes sense. So if we are going to have a discussion that we're going to possibly take off the referendum, that may be a significant factor on how I'm viewing all of this. And this goes to what Mr. Castillo was talking about and what Mr. Z was talking about. If it's sort of going to ultimately be an internal decision, ultimately what the plan looks like, and we provided no direction, I'd be very concerned about not providing any specifics. But if we are going to go towards a referendum at the end of the day, I have a little bit more confidence that even if we're vague in these documents, that ultimately our citizens are going to be voting on it. So I'm trying to balance all these things out. And if there's a sense by the council that no, we actually want to forego a vote, then I may view the actual words of the RFP differently, let's just say. Because that takes the checks off. So, Carol, while I hear you, I do actually want to bind this body at this point, because I'm going to be voting on this thing tonight. And some other council isn't going to basically be able to completely undo what we're voting on once we send this into motion. So that's where I'm coming at it. To put it succinctly, if we're going to be loosey on the document, then I want the public vote outside of the bonding issue. But if we're going to be more prescriptive, then, you know, I'll do my legislative duties and put the checks in myself. So that's where I commit this.
Vice Chair Lawrence?
I'll be real blunt. I agree with Dave. I think the public will want a vote on this. They'll expect a vote, and they deserve a vote. So I don't see this as something that we should even talk about as being up in the air at all if it gets to what you're talking about, Nader.
Okay, other comments? Let's go to Ms. Conley. Oh, Justin, I'm sorry.
Justin, go ahead.
Sorry, I had to come off mute. Okay, a couple of thoughts. I think the first is that I don't think, well, here's a suggestion. I think, well, everybody's, what I would suggest is that we say in the RFP that it's our intention and expectation that there will be a referendum. I don't think this document binds us to calling for a referendum because there's a different mechanism for that. I think it's fine to say that that's the intention and the expectation, but one of the things that I'm also concerned about is, you know, would they going to referendum, rightly or wrongly, telegraph that we're expecting that we'll have to borrow a certain amount, so therefore the bidders will build into their proposals?
Oh, Justin, can you go back a few? You're breaking up.
Okay, hold on just a second. Stupid headset. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. What I would suggest as an alternative is saying that it's our intention and expectation that there will be a referendum. I don't think this issuing an RFP binds us as a practical legal matter to holding a referendum, because I think that's a separate process. I think there's a possibility that by saying it in a way that, you know, somehow we think there's absolutely going to be a referendum, we could signal that we expect that we're going to have to borrow a certain amount, and that could change the economics of offers. So I think my modest proposal would be to say in the RFP that, you know, at this time it's our intention and expectation that this is going to happen, and the proposers should proceed accordingly. But you know, I think there's a separate mechanism for proceeding down the referendum road, and, you know, as a result, we should be clear-eyed about that and proceed accordingly.
Okay, how about I think Mr. Sharp had his hand up first, and then Ms. Conley.
Okay, in the first paragraph under 3.2, the second sentence, it allows for modification of the schedule. And I think that applies to, you know, any part of the schedule. And then in the second paragraph, and again, the second sentence, I think that's the point where we would want to indicate that regardless of any changes in specific dates about the schedule, that this project will not go forward unless there is a referendum that is held as the ultimate authorization for it to go forward. But right now, that second sentence is giving us a wiggle room to not hold the referendum, and I think we need to change that sentence in order to convey that we're definitely going to do it.
Ms. Conley?
Maybe because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not reading this with such legalese, but the paragraph Mr. Sharp's referring to, if we can just say, we just want to seek voter approval of a project of this magnitude, whether there's capital cost or not. I can't imagine that we would say, let's go forward and do this, this, and this, and not have a referendum. And I think that's how most people feel. So we just want to seek voter approval for a project of this magnitude that may or may not include capital cost. And then in the footnote that Mr. Snyder referenced, this seems more like a scheduling thing, that we're not guaranteeing that there's going to be a referendum in November 2016. Not that we might just say, yeah, no referendum.
Why don't you scroll down to the footnote language, Mr. Shields, if you can?
I don't know.
I mean, I view this footnote language as more like a legal caveat. And I think the idea, though, is that maybe we don't want any caveats. We don't want any wiggle room. We want the public to feel very confident that this is going to be put to referendum. So before we start, we know how it's going to finish with certainty. And so I think that's the concern and the reason to want to take away even what might in some ways be legally sound advice, to have a caveat. But, you know, we're acting not as lawyers today. We're acting as elected officials. So that may be the difference. Do we have others who want to speak to this? Mr. Webb?
Just real quick to weigh in as well. I do think we just may as well put the language in to say the public referendum piece of it, because this is going to be one of the biggest projects that the city has undertaken in our history. So I think that weighing in from the public is going to be an important part of it, that we're putting the kind of the nucleus in place of what we want from it. But I think ultimately when we hit a final product, I think we do want the public to weigh in, whether there's a financial impact or not, but we do want them to weigh in to say, yes, we approve of this project moving forward.
Okay. Sure, Ms. Kearney?
Second paragraph starting the schedule has been developed, that we just need to say to seek voter approval for the project, period. And then it sounds like that next sentence goes away and the footnote goes away. And I'm going to turn around, because we're not attorneys here, and I'm going to ask our attorneys, other than what you've already spoken to us about, which is we're committing to do a referendum regardless, is there a legal downside to removing those things that we don't understand because we're not attorneys, we're just elected officials? Are we putting ourselves in some other kind of sticky wicket situation that's making you guys really nervous if we remove that stuff?
I think it is just what we've said. I would agree with what Wyatt said. Is my concern about this is a document that sort of is out there for the people submitting proposals. And we're trying, I think, to convey something that we want to convey to the public in general. And you can do that, but I think you run a risk that something changes between now and next November. You don't want to do it. And one of your proposers complains about that, and you compromise this process. Whereas when you have this language in there, nothing's going to prevent you from having that, that referendum. But I think that you don't want to have that commitment out there to those submitting proposals. You want that commitment made to the public, and a different place to do it would be better. But again, it is up to, that's council and the school board's decision at this point.
So, what if while we go through the rest of the document, you guys worked on an alternate resolution or in addition to the existing resolutions or whatever that could be voted on that would say, for these two bodies to hold a referendum, and we just take all this stuff out of this document and just talk about the referendum at all, but it's a separate vote as a school board decision. Separate those things out.
That's not what I understand.
What we could look at the resolution and the whereases. I mean, just a fundamental fact, this RFP does not bind the governing bodies. And so if you're trying to bind the governing bodies, you need a different vehicle. It's kind of like akin to voluntary concessions. And sometimes there's a discussion that says the city shall do something in the developer's voluntary concessions. Well, no, that's not where we bind ourselves. And so this is similar to that. I think it's relevant in that suppose a proposer would really like to participate in this, but then they see the language and they say, oh, referendum, maybe I'll pull out and not participate because I don't want to deal with that. But then down the road, there are circumstances in which a referendum, the council decides a referendum is not required or desirable, then that proposer could say, well, I was given bad information on that. So, in other words, this is information for the proposers, and it's here to protect the city and to give the council options in the future. What the council is saying is, you don't want options. You want to have a referendum. I would submit that the place to make that commitment would be in a separate action. So that's our recommendation. If that's not what the council wants to do, then we can work on wordsmithing this.
Well, let me ask this, if I could. If we do a resolution, that's not going to be binding subsequent to this council's term, right? But if we put it in the document, this document is a binding document on the city, irrespective of the change of leadership that may happen or subsequent opinions. So I think there probably is, by putting in here, more certainty. I understand there's more risk, because you may possibly have some change circumstance that we don't contemplate right now. But I think you're also hearing from people that they want the public to be aware of where this comes out, how we know how it's going to come in, how it's going to end. And so I think that's a trade-off people are wrestling with, but I think there's a pretty strong opinion here in council, at least, that we do want to have a referendum, but there are a few more people to hear from, and so I don't want to preclude that. Why don't we go Ms. Oliver? I think I have her hand up before you did, and then we'll go to Michael if we can.
So as I listen to this discussion tonight, it brings me back to my original thought when we started this process. And I know that I'm in the minority in terms of my opinion here. But as I listen to this discussion, there are 3 points that are very clear to me. 1, the PPA process is not a good fit for Falls Church City. 2, this is maybe not the right time for us to embark on the PPA process if we're going to try to force it on ourselves. And 3, this entire process has been too rushed. Going back to my first point about it not being a comfortable fit, we want a referendum. Some people on the council want to involve other bodies. We don't have a consensus on exactly what it is that we want. And all of this makes it very difficult to go forward with a public-private partnership. I think that's really important for everybody to think about. I know I'm in the minority here, but I just want to raise that again. 2, I think it's the wrong timing. I think it's the wrong timing for us. I'd feel more comfortable if we delayed things for just 6 months, because we have the complications of an election. We have an awful lot on the city's plate right now, and the office market in the region is down. And we're trying to force something through in a time frame in which the office market is down. This is our last, this is not the last, but this is a significant space in the city. This just may not be the time to go forward with it. And 3, the fact that we're wordsmithing an RFP, which is normally a staff document, like minutes before we want to vote on it, that says to me that we have rushed this process too much, that we should not be doing this level of detailed language manipulation right before we vote. It says to me that we still don't have the consensus. And I'm concerned that we're going to go forward with a product that's not as good as it could have been, and that we're going to get an outcome that's not as good as it could have been. And I just wanted to be clear that I have concerns about this whole process for these 3 reasons, and this recent discussion just reinforces my concerns.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kuma?
I'm not sure if it's understood that this is going to cost us one way or another. Mr. Shields, is it fair to say this is either a pay now or pay later over time? This project is at some cost. Are we anticipating that someone's going to front it, but that we won't pay anything over time? Or are we anticipating that we're just, it's going to cost something. It's going to cost us. We're either giving up, we're either increasing our taxes, I don't know, 15, 20 cents, and pay for it up front, or we're foregoing some revenue over time. And we even thought about determining whether that's a 20-year period, a 50-year period, a 45-year period. I'm not sure we factored, we're thinking about the fact that this is going to, somebody has to pay for this. The developers may front it, but they'll get their pound of flesh. Ms. Shields, could you help me here?
And I assume you're asking that in the context of the question of whether we're going to have a referendum or not, right?
Exactly. And then my question then becomes, what is the referendum going to be about? That we finance it with the pay now or the pay later, or we're asking for permission to just build it? Why are we having the referendum?
Well, I think it's pretty probable that the city is going to incur significant debt one way or the other in this P3 process. The anticipation is that there could be a structure such as a tax increment financing structure in which the taxes from the new development and some degree pay for the debt service for the high school. And so it becomes a more affordable project than it would otherwise be. And so that's the basic concept. And then the land transaction in addition to that also should be helpful to the financing of the high school.
Are we selling land?
Either through a land lease or through a sale. And the language is we prefer a lease, but we would accept other structures because we want to see some of the costs and benefits of those different approaches. But the question is, I think it is likely that there will be an issuance of debt that would require a bond referendum.
Okay, I'm just trying to get away from the notion that it's not going to cost us anything. So.
Okay. Why don't we go to Mr. Duncan, then Mr. Snyder?
To take us back to where we started, which, as I understand it, was Mr. Snyder wanting to have a public referendum, not a bond referendum. I did not mean to disagree with that. I did want to ask the question about whether we're, driving the hardest bargain we can for the taxpayers. I actually was more concerned about the date, but as Mr. Sharp pointed out, the language gives us the flexibility, subject to revision, and the school board and the city council reserve the right to modify the schedule at any time as they deem necessary. So I'm at least willing to support just the change from bond to public referendum and leaving the footnote and the other language, well, leaving the footnote the way it is for the reasons that our attorneys tell us. I mean, my understanding of the reason that language is there is to protect us. We go through this process, the bodies approve, a proposer, and everything's great. The proposer thinks they're going through, and then the voters, for some reason, reject it. And the proposer comes and sues us for some reason. We want language that holds us harmless from, any liability there. So the only thing that would need then to change, as Ms. Conley said, would be to seek voter approval for the project in the language, in the paragraph, the schedule has been developed, et cetera, because we do want to broaden that to include not just a bond referendum, but a public referendum.
Mr. Snyder?
As I've heard people discuss this, we intend to have a referendum on this. It'll be a public referendum, which can include bond or not. And the problem with the footnote is that it says maybe we'll have a referendum, maybe we won't. And that's the fundamental issue. I don't care how it's worded, but I think the problem with the footnote, and for council to argue, oh, well, if we put it in here, it'll be binding, so we don't want to put it in here, we want to do it some other place, is exactly the reason why we need to remove the footnote, because we want it to be very clear to the public that this is going to go to them before it happens.
Okay. Vice Chair Lawrence?
Well,
Okay, Chair
Chair
Costello?
Castillo. Go ahead, Justin.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to ask a point of order at this point. I've been looking at the charter. There are other, with respect to borrowing. I think we need to take a step back and focus on the law and what our powers and the powers of the city council are. I've seen one thing in the charter that says that the city council, after resolution, can establish a referendum upon not less than 30 days and not more than 60 days notice? I just am asking a question as a pure matter of law and power. Is it possible to do, with respect to the referendum, what is being sought? Because I have some serious questions that it can be. And that's just a straight procedural matter of power and proper process.
I think that's a question for our city attorney. I think the question generally was, is it possible for council to, or council and the school board to put it in a document, since the charter apparently says you cannot, council can't call for a referendum less than 90 days, or less than 30 days, but more than 90 days in advance of a referendum. Did I capture that right, Justin?
Yeah, my take on it, I could be wrong, is that the referendum is the prerogative of council. I could be wrong, but that's what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
Do you understand the question?
I do, and I would just want to take a look at the charter, but it seems to me if you agree to do it, you would simply have to also, a future council would have to authorize it. But that's, again, where we don't know where we'll be at the time that authorization was sought. And that would be the concern, but it might be limited, you might limit the future actions because this council would be put at risk at that time if they decided not to do it. And there was a commitment in here to do it, a commitment to the proposers who were.
So how about some language along the lines of, we're going to issue a referendum, however, we'll have no liability if we don't. You know, something where it's, it maybe covers our legal basis, but at the same time clearly sets forth the intention of council and school board. I don't know if that covers this or not. I don't want to get too much into your business, but.
Well, and I think that could be done. I think that's what's intended here, and it may be just that the language is a little bit too strongly worded in one direction, that it's difficult, and we need to maybe work on that a little bit.
Yes, I think the idea that may be agreeable to some is that, look, we want to make it clear we are going to have a referendum, but we also want to make it clear we're not going to have liability if for some reason, maybe that sort of protects both bodies. But I think it's a pretty clear intention of most of the folks, if not all the folks at the table, that we want to put this out for the public to be the ultimate decision maker as to this proposal.
And not only that, Mayor, but I think that perhaps the better place to put that kind of language with that kind of specificity, which provides that we want to seek the approval of the public for funding as well as project, would be in Section 9 under reservation of rights, where we generally speak to these kinds of things. And then that also would make it a prima facie reservation by itself instead of some squirrely little footnote that at this point I think only lawyers understand what it says, and I think if you have 3 lawyers in the room, they have 3 different opinions about what it says.
Did you follow that comment?
I think I might have missed some of the words at the very end, but yes, I think that adding the reservation of rights on this point to Section 9 might be very useful and might help, because at this point you could simply express the intent to, to conduct a referendum before the project goes forward, and then just move the other part to a different location. I think you might also want to, it might be useful to say that there's no obligation to the proposers to have a referendum. In other words, that's who you're really talking to. It's sort of semantics, but it also clarifies that you are committed to the public to doing that.
What do folks think of that? Does that sound agreeable to Ms. Ward?
Yes, I also wanted to add that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we need to do separate the referendum for the public approval versus the referendum to finance the project. There'd be two separate, distinct issues? No, they're not. I was going back to what Phil had mentioned earlier about saying, you know, that we are going to have this, we're going to fund it. And he was, and Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like you were opposed to having language regarding a bond because you don't want to give the developers the idea that we're willing to pay for a large part of this project. Is that correct?
That was what I raised initially. It's not a deal breaker for me. The language as it's evolving is to my satisfaction.
Okay, I just didn't know if that was feasible to separate the two, just to have a referendum just for approval of the project and then one separate for bond. We can't do that. That's not a bit.
You could, yes, but you probably wouldn't want to, because even if you were going to do the two referenda, you'd be doing them together. If you were doing a bond referenda, that would be the same as a project one. You wouldn't want to necessarily have two questions at that point if you had one for bonding. And if you didn't, you would just have one referendum.
So I guess, do we have a consensus then to have sort of in this section some strong language that we intend to do this, but put in the reservation of rights section a caveat that protects us legally? Is there a consensus of that? Okay, let's move on then.
So the next section, I think,
Wait, I think you skipped one. I don't know if that was.
there's just a strike.
Okay, why don't you go down slowly?
There's a striking of the just a commercial real
All right.
estate development. The timing of the work, I don't think that's substantive. Section K, this was discussed at the work session. This is the actual language relating to the asking the proposers to identify and describe any involvement in the project development on the part of any owners or tenants of adjacent properties. And that's on page 12. And then we move to the evaluation process and criteria. And so this is the last section that has significant changes.
This is just a minor point, but it says for purposes of this RFP only, this section 5.0, I mean, it's actually in section 5.1. I don't know if that's a typo or not. And maybe it should say purposes RFP only, section 5.0 shall supersede, or, okay, it's weird.
Yeah.
The numbering is weird on this, actually.
Yeah, I think the reference is to clarify that it's the entire
Already-
section 5.0.
Okay, it's just, the numbering seems weird, but I don't care.
So the reference to the renovated high school, middle school expansion, all of which meet the school board's projected increase. And we go down to C, and it reads whether and to what extent the proposer's concept for redeveloping up to 10.38 acres of the parcels, and then it just lists the three criteria, and so we will need to work into this Romanet 3, the discussion about the transportation to and through the site, and so we'll make that parallel. Are there any other changes or discussion of this section?
Keep on going.
All right. And then E, we do have in the evaluation criteria any anticipated involvement in the project development or part of the owners or tenants of adjacent properties. This is just a question of timing here at 5.5. So this was a technical change. I don't think this came out from council comments, but we would evaluate the reasonableness and anticipated effectiveness of the proposer's strategies and plans to be implemented following the execution of the comprehensive agreement. That's paragraph A at the top of page 17 on the marked up copy. It may be different on the clean copy.
Go back up briefly to the anticipated community, educational, blah, blah, blah. Let's see.
Yes. So this is the last criteria area, project benefit and compatibility. So we've added in anticipated community, educational, social, environmental, and transportation benefits of the project that are unique to the proposer's approach to the project, along with the project's compatibility with current governmental planning.
Not sure I understand that, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't know if we have any current governmental planning on that site, do we?
It's very, very spare.
Well, and wasn't there at one point a reference to compliance with the comp plan? Is that where?
Yeah, so we have taken that out because the comp plan does not, we have not done a comp plan amendment for the site yet.
Right, but we're going to, and we would want it to comply. I mean, it seems like when you say compatibility with current governmental planning, to me, I hear comp plan. So I'm just trying to figure out why we wouldn't say that, since every other project, people have to come in and explain how it fits into our comp plan, right?
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's going to be difficult on this site because the comp plan does not speak to this site.
So I don't know how, what's this section entitled?
So this is the community benefits.
But is this an evaluation criteria? So scroll back down if you don't mind. I have to say, I'm not sure, I mean, read that language, what that's getting at. What was the genesis of that? Why was that section put in? Did we have comment about that last? I don't recall comment as to that point. I guess there's a couple reasons why I'm not sure I understand what it's saying. Benefits that are unique to the proposer's approach to the project. What is that intending to mean?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be pretty obvious from their proposals. So what this would be, you know, in terms of evaluating it, we would be saying, okay, what's unique to this proposer?
But they'd have to know what the other proposals are, wouldn't they, to know what's unique?
No, but the evaluation team will.
So they're going to say, we're saying what's different about this one, but is that really, was that a critical evaluation for us? In other words, don't we want what we want, no matter if everyone provides it or not? Just because it's unique doesn't mean it's desired.
Well, and just not having been here last week, but I think that what this might enable you all to do is to find something particular in a proposal that you find to be very compelling, and that would therefore enable you to identify it under this paragraph as something that gives them sort of a lot of traction in terms of having their proposal evaluated well. That's the one place where I could see it could make a difference. In other words, they have something very particular that's unusual, but that you really want to give them a lot of credit for, possibly.
But don't we have an unfettered right to pick any proposal, irrespective of whether it, meets the criteria or not? In other words, this isn't like a federal procurement where you get points for each different matrix or whatever. We can pick whatever proposal we want, correct? Irrespective of whether, quote, someone might think it's unique or the best one. It's up to us to decide that.
You have a good amount of discretion, but I think it also has to fit within the general evaluation criteria that were in the RFP. But yes, there's a good amount of discretion that's available.
Mayor, I don't see a harm in putting that in there. Actually, I think it's to our benefit. That's kind of the last criteria here that says, and anything else that you think is really special about yours that we might like or not.
Okay.
I'm okay with it.
It's fine, just doesn't read very well to me, but anyway. Okay, other comments on this, or should we move on to the next point?
I have a quick question. With reference to current governmental planning, is that just Falls Church, Virginia, Fairfax, all three?
Well, it could very well be best practices of other governmental or non-governmental or advisory, quasi-governmental, other country governmental bodies. Like I said, I'm not, I would reword it differently, but I don't think that we need to spend our time on this.
Not to belabor this point, but since there is no governmental planning, it sounds like on this site, should we just take out the word current and just put governmental planning?
Well, one thing that we should note is that the school, Appendix C is actually pretty detailed in terms of the school programmatic needs, and so that is certainly governmental planning that we would be measuring their compliance against.
All right, why don't we keep going then?
I think that runs through our major track changes.
Oh, can we also have guidelines, correct, that we really haven't spent a whole lot of time on? We'd like to go through those, the guidelines, which are the secondary document.
These, the PPEA guidelines, we have
Yes.
not had a robust discussion of those, and I'll turn that over to Carol for just a quick briefing on those.
The guidelines, and I think the school board already has adopted their revised guidelines. So we could take this up with the council's discussion. But the guidelines were revised beginning with the recommendation by the initial outside counsel. And the revisions really are not substantive. There's one particular change that it enables, there's an option included now for the city council to request fees when for solicited proposals. It doesn't require it on every proposal that's solicited. It does have it automatically on unsolicited proposals, but it does give you that option. Other than that, really the changes were to simply streamline the document. Redundancies have been removed. Things have been reorganized a bit to better reflect the sequence of projects under the PPEA. Some unnecessary general language has been removed. The revised guidelines also have updated the standards to incorporate and reflect recent experience by various jurisdictions and incorporate the best practices in administering PPEA projects. So it's really a rewrite that is just to clarify and update the document. I will note that there are some bullets that were not filled in the latest version that you have in your packet. And if you look at, I believe it's page 4. No, it's page 5, I'm sorry, in section 4.3.2.1. It's the fees for unsolicited proposals. The amounts being recommended for the initial processing fee is $7,500 with an additional conceptual phase proposal fee of $20,000, which would be charged if you went forward with accepting the unsolicited proposal and soliciting others to cover the costs of consultants, et cetera, that are needed for the evaluation of those proposals. And those numbers appear 2 places in those paragraphs where there are currently just bullets. So that's really the extent of the changes. They're not, as I say, substantive, really. It's just a more streamlined document that reflects modern practices and the experience of sort of the industry over the last few years. So if there are any questions, we think this document will better serve you. We started the project with initial outside counsel, but the revised guidelines have been reviewed also by the current outside counsel.
So I'm wondering if we could take a step back, because we really haven't had an in-depth discussion. I know you were out of town last week, but we didn't get to the guidelines or didn't spend a lot of time on those. Maybe, Mr. Shields, you could just take us through the document briefly, and we've heard the changes, but maybe see if anyone's got any questions in a brief run-through. Would that be okay with folks? Yes, Ms. Conley.
Ms. McCusker, I just have one question. If we do get through this RFP tonight and are able to issue it by July 30th, does that then preclude all unsolicited bids because the process has begun?
It doesn't preclude them. Somebody could submit a new one. If it were for this type of project, of course, the fact that you have a solicited RFP out there would probably affect how City Council and or the school board wanted to consider that proposal, but it wouldn't prohibit somebody from submitting one.
Okay.
So why don't we go briefly through the guidelines, if we could? briefly.
You want to go through
Well, maybe
them?
we should have Mr.
I can, yeah, I don't have a lot to say about them either, because they don't really change much. But they begin with applicability, and they talk about the overview, that being the responsible public entity. It notes that the responsible public entities in the city could be either the city council or the school board, and that the school board would be the RPE primarily for school projects, and the council would be for other types of projects in the city. It references the eligible projects, referring primarily and giving some examples from the PPEA, the state law, but doesn't include everything. I think previously we had the entire list there, and that's one example of something that's been streamlined. It then, has some general provisions which generally reflect the requirements of the state law, the PPEA. It talks about proposal review fees.
Let me stop you on the proposal review fees. I know you spoke to that a minute ago.
Yeah.
My recollection was there was no fees previously. Was that mistaken?
Yes, under the current guidelines do contain a fee for unsolicited proposals of $25,000.
Okay, but the RFP that we've issued has no fees. Is that right?
That's correct,
Okay.
and that's done to preserve the competition. Now, what the new guidelines propose to do is would have fees for unsolicited proposals. It's a $7,500 fee just to submit it, and then if the council decides to accept it and move forward, we'd require an additional $20,000, because at that point we'd have analysis and outside help. Under 4.3.2.2, you now have the authority under your guidelines to impose a fee with a solicited proposal. Frequently, that's not done simply so that you get the best competition you can and don't dissuade people from submitting, but you do have the option to do that at this time. That's really the one change that's in here.
So these cover both solicited and unsolicited. So
That's
these are
correct.
overall PPEA guidelines, whether it's solicited basket or the unsolicited basket.
That's correct. They would cover all projects
And the
in the city.
RFP that we're discussing right now would take preference, and so if there's an event of a conflict, the RFP takes precedent, correct?
That's correct. And if you compared these documents carefully, you would see that the structure's pretty similar for the two things. And you will note, we talked about some language tonight where 5.0, Section 5.0 of the RFP is specifically supersedes part of the guidelines. And there's another place that was already in the RFP that says it specifically supersedes. That section specifically supersedes part of the guidelines. But in general, the guidelines are your overarching document that governs your procedures, and then your RFP would be specific to the project, and you would just about always say that document takes precedence. And that has been done in this RFP. That is, it notes that where it is different from the guidelines in specific matters that aren't generally called out, it governs the RFP.
Gotcha. So for purposes of tonight, we're focusing on the RFP. This document is only relevant to the extent the subject matter isn't addressed in the RFP.
That's correct. And this document, though, is recommended because it gives a clearer and more modern approach to the guidelines in general, and therefore will serve you better as sort of your backup to your RFP.
Okay. Can you maybe discuss the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, the relevance to both the RFP and to this document, just so the idea that people can understand what is publicly available, what might not be, and how that works, particularly with this project or proposal?
Right. Yes. Under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, there is an exemption for materials that are submitted as part of PPEA proposals that are considered trade secrets or otherwise, or confidential financial information. And I'm not going to come up with all three of the categories right now, but there are three things that are named. And it usually is a substantial amount of information, as we saw when we received the unsolicited proposal. So generally, information is public unless it is identified by the proposer when they make their submission as being a confidential or a trade secret. And if it is so identified, and if it is agreed between ultimately the jurisdiction or the responsible public entity and the proposer that it's confidential, then it is not subject to disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act. There is room for a process when a proposer submits their material and identifies certain information as confidential or a trade secret, which enables the RPE to review their material and challenge their discussion. And ultimately, the city could say that we believe something is not a trade secret and we will disclose it. And then the applicant has the ability to either withdraw their proposal or allow it to be discussed. So there is some process for identifying what is actually a trade secret or confidential information under the Act. But once it is identified by the proposer as such and agreed by the city, then the Freedom of Information Act protects it and makes it confidential. And that's one of the things that is difficult. We have very complex proposals coming in under this for this RFP, and the unsolicited proposal was very complex. And so there's a great deal of information that's confidential simply because it represents how the whole project would work together.
I think that's why at least members of council have some questions about this, because we'd like to disseminate as much information publicly as available, but the law precludes that. And so that's where you really have the rub.
Yes, and ultimately, I think it will stand the city and the school board in good stead when truly trade secrets, confidential information is protected in this way, because that will enable us to have a process with integrity and a procurement process that gets us the best deal that we can. And ultimately, when we reach an agreement, much of this information then becomes public.
Why don't we keep rolling through this unless there are any questions?
Is this the time to ask the question that
Sure.
I posed in my email about, the nature of public dialogue during an election season as we're faced with questions, debates, and questionnaires and so forth regarding the process and how we deal with those? Last week we talked about that. You missed the fun, but the view that was shared by Mr. Wall was not warmly greeted, I think.
Well, and I think it does create somewhat of a difficult situation, because so much of this information that will be developed between, or that will come in to the city is going to be confidential, and it is difficult, and it is important to recognize that to get a good procurement process, we need to maintain the confidentiality of this information and make sure that council and school board members do not get out in making representations about the RFP that aren't exactly consistent with that document, because that document represents what we're expecting people to make their proposals based on. And it will be very important that they not be misled in any way. I mean, even and I know it would be inadvertent, but in such a way that they would believe that certain things were more important, because the definition is that document, as you all have struggled to a great deal with the language, recognizing that there are many nuances to this that become important. So I think that document represents what the criteria are for evaluation and what people are going to be judged on. And then there may be addenda when questions come in, but those addenda will all be issued through the purchasing office so that everyone is making their proposal based on the same requirements and understand the same evaluation criteria.
Okay, why don't we keep on trucking unless there's some other comments or
I'm
questions?
not quite finished with that, but I'll leave
Okay,
it for
go.
now. Could I ask, though, one other question
Of course,
about the
of course you can.
responsible public entity for the respective activities, a school or a city? I heard you describe, each body has its own responsibilities, but as it relates to the project that's before us, which is a hybrid, is there any reason to believe that, the school board or the city council are ceding any kind of authority to the other body, or is this a collaborative and joint endeavor?
This is a collaborative and joint endeavor, and I think the RFP makes that clear, that at some point, when there's a comprehensive agreement, the different parties may enter into it for different aspects of the project, but that they will be working together throughout the project, and actions will not be taken unless both parties are in agreement.
Okay, and the only other thing to the election stuff is I wrote down what you said about as long as representations are consistent with what the language of the RFP says, then that degree of public comment would be allowed by a candidate or anyone. Well, we're talking about incumbents here who are, as a practical matter, that's the script that you need to stick to. And in terms of what information will be available, because nothing is really due to us until October 30th, we don't expect. We're
That's
not,
correct.
as a practical matter, going to be dealing with any kind of sensitive information during the campaign about the proposals.
That's right. Right now, what you're really looking at is the fact that you're in the midst of a procurement process, and the integrity of that process needs to be maintained. But that's correct. The confidential information will not come in till the end of October.
Thank you.
Okay, other comments, or should we keep on going? Mr. Sharp?
The evaluation that we would be putting on this, much of it is kind of flexible at this point, with such concepts as the project will benefit the city and the surrounding community is one of the ways that the benefit is described. And I think as we go forward, Mr. Shields talked about involving the public as much as possible in how we do this process. And that was specifically, I think, relating to whether we would have additional people on the evaluation team. Well, I'm not arguing at this point for additional people on that team, but I am suggesting that we need additional processes outside of the team's confidential work, where the public can provide their input on what is beneficial to them, both within our community and those, of our neighbors. What it is that would be compatible for them, what kinds of additional projects they may have in mind that they want to pursue. And to the extent we can gather that information and have it available for our evaluation team to determine, okay, what are the benefits for this project? That's where I think the involvement of the public can be very important. And it doesn't involve confidential material. It doesn't involve the analysis of some proposers' balance sheets or anything of that nature. But it does involve a rather intensified, at least I would hope it would be an intensified questioning of what is it that the public really wants to see from this project? What would be beneficial for them? And to gather that information over the next 90 days or so, get as much of it to be available to the proposers as possible. But it will also have an influence on what the evaluation team eventually comes up with.
Yes, and I think it's also good to remember that this is the conceptual phase, and much of that more detailed information about exactly what is going to be, or what we want, is going to be very useful as we move into phase 2, and we have more specifics and more direction given to people, to the proposers in terms of what they're to be submitting.
Okay, why don't we keep rolling through this document?
think we're done with the document.
So the guidelines, we're done, that was it?
I think there are a few more provisions on solicited, unsolicited proposals, all of which are really sort of technical. They outline the nature of a proposal, what elements that is to be submitted, what elements it should include, and they reflect in many ways, as I said earlier, the same thing that's in the RFP, because in many ways they overlap. And that's really, and then I think at the end, we probably do have some reservations of rights for all proposals and some explanation of the commitments that we expect a proposer to make when they enter into this process.
Okay, are there any comments that haven't been asked about the guidelines? Ms. Conley?
I'd just like to confirm, these guidelines will match the school board's guidelines. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. They're obviously with the names changed.
Right.
For the two documents, yeah.
And the school board's already approved their guidelines.
That's correct.
Okay, any other comments from anyone, either on the RFP or the guidelines? Okay, is there anything else? Yes.
I move we continue this meeting past 10:30.
We have a second? This is for city council folks. All in favor on city council?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it. We're going to keep talking here. So unless there's any other comments from the school folks or the city folks, city council folks, I suggest we go ahead and go our separate ways for this evening. It seems like we have a consensus on at least what will be voted on as far as this document. And we will continue our regular meeting. The city council will, after, let's say, a 5-minute adjournment. And otherwise, look forward to continuing to work with you all. Thanks for everyone coming out this evening on the school board side. Our public hearing will continue 5 minutes from now. And folks who want to make public comment can do so at that time. Thank you very much.